The stories we inherit feel like solid ground, a world of clear moral lines, where kindness is rewarded, where evil is punished, and where a lost slipper leads to a throne. But what if the original story demanded a higher price, a price paid in blood, to make the slipper fit? What if the girl in the red cloak was first tricked into a feast of unspeakable cruelty? What if the monsters in these stories gave a name to a much more real and much more common horror? And what if their roots run deeper and spread wider than we ever imagined? These are the stories you think you know. It is time to uncover the haunting truth of what they were. To find the truth of these stories, one must first look beyond the printed page. Before the tidy books with their gilded spines, there was a different kind of library, vast, ancient, and unwritten. This was the oral tradition, a world where memory was the only ink and the human voice was the only page. For thousands of years, this was how humanity kept its culture, as a living, breathing, and constantly changing current of spoken words. A tale spoken is a fundamentally different entity from a tale that is read. A written story is a fixed object, a fly trapped in amber, identical for every reader across every century. A story in the oral tradition is fluid. It is a tool shaped and reshaped by the teller for the needs of a specific audience, on a specific night, in a specific room. It remembered the past, but it lived entirely in the present, a performance rather than a text. These tales were the property of the common people, told in the intimate settings of the fireside and the loom. They were, overwhelmingly, the domain of women, woven into the fabric of their daily work and social lives. A story could be a way to pass the crushing monotony of spinning wool, a method to soothe a child, or a social currency traded for a bit of gossip or a piece of bread. They were a constant, essential presence in the sonic landscape of the pre-modern world. Their purpose was deeply utilitarian. In a world without widespread literacy, a memorable story was the most effective vehicle for transmitting vital information. A tale about a girl who strayed from the path and was eaten by a wolf was a potent and unforgettable lesson about the very real dangers of the surrounding forest. Stories encoded social rules, mapped out kinship obligations, and issued stark warnings about the consequences of greed, foolishness, or hubris. They were tools for living, a kind of survival guide for the soul, passed down through generations. They were as purposeful and necessary as a well-kept axe or a sharp needle. To understand the haunting truth behind the fairy tale, one must first understand this world, where every story served a purpose. It was a map, a warning, and a weapon against the dark. A story that functions as a map presents a unique challenge to those who come later. How does one chart an ocean that changes with every wave? For centuries, the sheer scale and fluidity of the oral tradition made it seem like a chaotic wilderness, impossible to survey. Yet within this wilderness, scholars began to detect patterns, foundational plots that appeared again and again across thousands of miles and hundreds of years. To classify these patterns, they created a tool, a kind of master key to the world's unwritten library. This tool is the Arne Thompson-Uther Index, or the ATU Index. It is one of the most important achievements in the field of folkloristics, a massive classification system that does for folktales what botany does for plants. The index identifies and catalogues thousands of distinct tale types, core narrative structures that form the blueprints for the stories we know. It allows scholars to trace a single story's genetic code, to see how a tale from medieval France might share a common ancestor with one from ancient Persia. The system functions by assigning a number to each core plot. For example, ATU 333 is the tale type known as the glutton, where a character is tricked and eaten by a wolf. This is the ancient family to which Little Red Riding Hood belongs. ATU 510A is the tale type of the persecuted heroine, the abused and outcast young woman who is eventually recognized for her true worth. This is the global blueprint for Cinderella. This index is the essential tool for our investigation. It allows us to move beyond the familiar, sanitized versions of the stories collected by authors like the Brothers Grimm, and to see the larger, wilder family of tales from which they were selected. It provides the map we need to navigate the great, dark forest of the oral tradition and to trace the haunting truths of these stories back to their very source. The source of these tales is found in the noise and rhythms of the pre-modern world. The stories lived in places like the spinstube, the communal spinning rooms that were the social hubs for women in German-speaking lands. Here, for centuries, the telling of Märchen, or fairy tales, was woven directly into the fabric of nightly labor. A story helped the hands stay busy and the mind stay sharp through the crushing monotony of spinning flax and wool into thread. This context is the key to their original form. These were overwhelmingly the domain of women, passed from mother to daughter, from old spinster to young bride. Men had their own cycles of stories, tales of heroic deeds and epic battles, but the fairy tale, with its focus on domestic dangers, family strife, and the challenges of navigating a patriarchal world, belonged to the private, laborious world of women. The tales were shaped by their concerns, their fears, and their sharp-witted wisdom. The Brothers Grimm, in crafting their national project, understood the power of this image. They publicly promoted figures like Dorothea Wiemann as their ideal Märchenfrau, a rustic, illiterate peasant woman channeling the pure spirit of the German folk. The reality was a carefully constructed fiction. Wiemann was, in fact, the literate middle-class wife of a tailor from a family of Huguenot descent with deep roots in French storytelling. The Grimms deliberately altered her identity, branding her as a peasant to make their collection appear more authentically German and from the soil. This was the first, foundational act of taming, not of the tales, but of the storytellers themselves. The tales they told served a direct and unsentimental purpose, lacking any impulse to coddle or entertain in the modern sense. A story was a piece of social software, a memorable way to install a crucial lesson in a young mind. Do not trust charming strangers, keep your wits about you, understand the unsparing economics of marriage, and know that the world beyond the village is a place of profound and unforgiving danger. The fireside and the loom, therefore, were the original crucibles of the fairy tale. It was here, amidst the hum of the spinning wheel and the crackle of the hearth, that the stories were forged, tempered by the lived experiences of the women who told them. They were a testament to their resilience, their pragmatism, and their unflinching understanding of the world as it was. To understand the world as it was, one must first understand its sky. For the pre-modern European peasant, the heavens functioned as a brittle and unpredictable engine of fate. The modern mind conceives of food as a commodity, an item in a store. For the medieval mind, food was a miracle, and it was a miracle that failed with devastating regularity. Their entire existence was a desperate gamble on the weather. Life was lived at the absolute margin of survival. A single week of too much rain could rot the seed in the earth. A month of drought could wither the stalks of wheat and barley into dust. An untimely frost in late spring could kill the budding fruit on the vine. These events were death sentences, erasing a year of back-breaking labor in a matter of hours and leaving a community with empty hands and hollow bellies. The result was a psychological landscape defined by constant, low-level anxiety. The hungry gap, the early spring months when the previous year's stores had dwindled to almost nothing and the new crops had yet to grow, was an annual period of dread. This was a time of rationing, of foraging for roots and weeds, of watching one's children grow thinner. This ever-present fear of starvation shaped the very structure of their stories. The obsession with food in fairy tales, the gingerbread house, the stolen cabbages from the witch's garden, the magical pot that produces endless porridge, is the direct result of a world that never had enough of it. It is the literature of a starving people, for whom the ultimate fantasy was a full belly. This grinding reality gave birth to a specific kind of monster. The wolf first existed as a metaphor, the walking embodiment of the hunger that gnawed at their own insides. It was the creature with the endlessly empty stomach, the predator whose cravings could never be satisfied. This is the elemental truth upon which the oldest fairy tales are built. They are stories from a world where the greatest and most immediate horror was the failure of the earth and the emptiness of the larder. They are tales haunted by the spectre of starvation, and the wolf gave a face to the beast that was already at their door. In the spring of 1315, the beast broke the door. After years of fragile harvests and a population at its peak, the weather turned. It began to rain. It rained through the spring, extinguishing the hope of planting. It rained through the summer, rotting the grain in the fields before it could ripen. It rained through the autumn, making the ground a sea of mud, impossible to plough. This was the beginning of the Great Famine, a multi-year cataclysm that would erase 10 to 15% of Northern Europe's population. The immediate effect was a catastrophic failure of the harvest on a continental scale. Grain prices skyrocketed, multiplying 8 times over in some regions. What little food was available became the sole property of the rich, the lords and clergy who could afford it. For the vast majority of the population, the peasantry, the market was empty. Their own meager stores, already strained, vanished in a matter of months. The year 1316 was worse. The rain continued. Peasants, in their desperation, consumed the seed grain they had saved for planting, a decision that guaranteed starvation in the year to follow. They ate their draft animals, sacrificing their only means of ploughing the land. The bonds of the feudal system, a structure built on mutual obligation between lord and peasant, shattered. Lords, desperate to protect their own families and resources, turned the starving away from their gates. The social fabric of Europe began to unravel. Chroniclers of the period describe a world descending into chaos. The roads became the domain of bandits. Homes were barricaded against desperate, starving neighbors. Parents, unable to feed their children, were forced into the ultimate act of despair. The old and the sick were the first to die. But soon, death became indiscriminate, stalking the streets of Paris and London as surely as it haunted the isolated rural villages. This was a world turned upside down, where the fundamental rules of civilization were suspended by the biological reality of starvation. The horror was absolute. Contemporary accounts from across Europe from Ireland to Poland, speak of the darkest of human taboos becoming a grim reality. It is in this specific historical context that the fairy tale of a witch who eats children, or a desperate parent who abandons their young in the woods, finds its chilling source code. The story of Hansel and Gretel is perhaps the most direct translation of the Great Famine's trauma into the language of folklore. It is a tale built entirely around the core anxieties of this period. It contains the desperate parents, forced to choose between the survival of the adults and the lives of their children. It contains the unforgiving wilderness, the forest as the place where the abandoned go to die. And most importantly, it contains the house made of food. The witch's gingerbread cottage is the ultimate fantasy of a starving child, a vision of impossible abundance in a world of absolute scarcity. Yet, even this fantasy is a trap. The promise of food leads directly to the threat of being eaten in turn, a direct echo of the rumors and realities of cannibalism that haunted the famine years. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was the very furnace in which the darkest elements of these stories were forged. It seared the lived experience of child abandonment, of starvation, and of cannibalism into the collective memory of European peasantry. The tales became the scars, the cultural trauma passed down by the survivors, a permanent and sobering reminder of what happens when the brittle heaven finally breaks. The most disturbing reminders of the Great Famine are found in the words of those who witnessed it. Across Europe, chroniclers, monks, officials, and town clerks began to document the suspension of the most sacred laws of God and man. They recorded the stories with a sobering mixture of horror and resignation, presenting them as the grim, factual outcome of a world pushed beyond its limits. And the most shocking of these accounts concerned the final, unthinkable taboo: cannibalism. The reports were disturbingly consistent. The Irish annals spoke of the poor digging up the freshly buried to eat the corpses. Chroniclers in Flanders and England recorded stories of prisons where inmates would devour new arrivals, and of travelers being ambushed on the roads. Most chilling of all were the accounts of secret cannibalism within the home, where the starving would prey upon the weakest members of their own communities and even their own families. While some of these accounts were certainly exaggerated rumors born of terror, the sheer volume and geographical spread of the reports points to a grim underlying reality. This was anthropophagy, born of pure biological necessity, the last, desperate act of a human body consuming itself to survive. It is this specific, historical horror that echoes in the fairy tale ovens of witches and the flesh-eating giants who can smell the blood of their prey. A more common, and perhaps more psychologically scarring reality was the act of child abandonment. For a parent watching their children starve, with no hope of providing food, the choice became a harrowing calculus. Leaving a child in a town, near a monastery, or at a crossroads was a desperate gamble, an act that might give the child a slim chance of being found and cared for by someone with resources, while allowing the parents to survive. This act, known as oblation, when done formally with the church, became a widespread, informal strategy for survival during the famine years. It was a choice born of a desperate love. Yet, it created a generation of orphans and foundlings and seared a deep trauma into the popular consciousness. The forest of Hansel and Gretel, or the wilderness into which Snow White is cast, are the narrative spaces where this real-world trauma was processed. These tales treat the act with a notable lack of condemnation. The parents, particularly the father, are often portrayed as weak and grief-stricken, pushed into the act by the cruelty of the stepmother, a figure who conveniently absorbs all the guilt. This narrative structure serves a vital psychological function. It allows the story to explore the primal terror of being abandoned by one's parents, while simultaneously creating a psychological buffer that protects the sacred image of the good parent. Therefore, the unspeakable acts that populate the darkest corners of European fairy tales are not the product of a ghoulish imagination. They are the fossilized remains of historical memory. They are the faint, chilling echoes of a time when the choice to abandon a child in the woods was a rational, if agonizing, decision, and when the gnawing hunger in one's own belly made the flesh of another human being a conceivable source of food. This gnawing hunger, the kind that could make a person see their neighbor as a source of food, required a face. The human mind, under the pressure of such an extreme and prolonged trauma, needed to project its own horrifying new capacities onto an external figure. It needed a monster that could contain the memory of its own desperation. That monster was the wolf. The fairy tale wolf is defined by one single, overriding characteristic: an insatiable, boundless appetite. It is a walking stomach. It consumes grandmothers, children, and entire herds of goats, yet its hunger is never satisfied. This folkloric portrayal has little to do with the behavior of real wolves and everything to do with the lived experience of human starvation, where the body's cravings become an all-consuming, monstrous force. The wolf of the folktale is also a master of disguise and deception. It can mimic a human voice, don a grandmother's nightclothes, and use cunning language to lure its victims. This reflects the social horrors of the Great Famine. In a world where the bonds of community had shattered, the greatest danger was the neighbor who feigned friendship, the stranger who offered false help, or even the family member whose familiar face concealed a desperate, predatory intent. The wolf's disguise is the mask worn by the starving. This archetype, forged in the furnace of the Great Famine, became the definitive predator of the European folk mind. When a storyteller spoke of the big bad wolf, it was a potent narrative shorthand. The phrase conjured the immediate, visceral memory of starvation. It invoked the terror of social breakdown, the fear of the cunning neighbor, and the latent potential for violence that lurked within every hungry belly. The wolf at the door was always more than an animal. It was a symbol for the failure of the harvest. It was the embodiment of the starving stranger, the desperate parent, and the cannibal. It was the name given to the sobering discovery that, when the brittle heaven breaks and the social order collapses, the most dangerous predator is the human being stripped of everything but their own gnawing hunger. This is the first great, haunting truth behind the fairy tales. They are built upon a deep and historically grounded fear of the monster that starvation makes of man. The dark forest of the fairy tale is not a place of fantasy. It is the landscape of memory, and its alpha predator is the famine wolf. The dark forest is the landscape of memory, but it is also the landscape of the mind. In the architecture of the fairy tale, the forest is the primary and most resonant symbol for the subconscious. The village, with its neat fences and ordered society, represents the conscious self, the world of rules, identity, and rational thought. To leave the village and step under the canopy of the trees is to begin a journey inward, into the unmapped territory of one's own psyche. This is a place outside the laws of man, It is a realm of chaos, instinct, and transformation, where the normal rules of reality are suspended. Time can warp, animals can speak, and the path behind you can vanish without a trace. It is here, in this state of acute disorientation, that the fairy tale hero or heroine is stripped of their social identity and forced to confront their true nature. The forest is the great equalizer, a place of symbolic death, allowing an old self to be shed so a new, more integrated self can be born. Every element of the folkloric forest serves this psychological purpose. The winding, confusing paths represent the perplexing nature of one's own life choices. The sudden appearance of a helper, a wise old woman, a talking fox, symbolizes the eruption of intuition, the unexpected arrival of an answer from the depths of the unconscious. The sudden clearing, the place of confrontation with the wolf or the witch, is the moment the hero comes face to face with their own shadow self, the parts of their personality they have repressed or ignored. The journey through the woods is therefore a map of a psychological process. It is the narrative representation of confronting a deep-seated fear, overcoming a personal flaw, or integrating a lost part of one's own soul. The hero who emerges from the other side of the forest is fundamentally changed by the journey. This is why the forest is the essential stage for these tales. It is the laboratory of the self. The historical dangers of the real medieval forest, the wolves, the bandits, the starvation, provided the raw material, the visceral vocabulary of fear. The folk mind then took this physical reality and transformed it into a permanent and universal symbol for the dangerous but necessary journey into the wild places within ourselves. The journey into the wild places within the self is rarely a voluntary one. Often, the hero is pushed, and in the world of the fairy tale, the push almost always comes from the same figure, the wicked stepmother. She is the first monster, the one who lives inside the house. She is the agent of the heroine's exile, the domestic tyrant whose cruelty is the catalyst for the entire story. This archetypal villain is a direct reflection of a grim historical reality. In the pre-modern world, childbirth was a leading cause of death for women. A huge number of men were widowers who remarried, and a huge number of children were raised by a woman who was not their biological mother. The very presence of a stepmother in a household was a common and often deeply fraught feature of family life. The new wife entered a precarious and difficult position. Her authority was often insecure, her connection to her husband's children purely legal, not biological. Her own survival, and that of her own future children, depended entirely on her ability to secure her husband's resources. In a world of finite wealth and food, the pre-existing children of the first wife were, in the coldest possible terms, direct competition. The fairy tale takes this complex socio-economic tension and transforms it into a stark moral drama of jealousy and persecution. The stepmother's resentment of the stepdaughter's youth, beauty, or claim to the father's affection is the narrative expression of this underlying resource competition. When the queen in Snow White asks her mirror, who is the fairest of them all, she is really asking, who has the most value in this household? Who has the greatest claim to the throne, the inheritance, the future? She is, therefore, a vitally important character. As we saw during the Great Famine, the stepmother often becomes the narrative scapegoat for the father's weakness. She is the one who voices the terrible pragmatic solution, the abandonment of the children. allowing the father to acquiesce through grief, his own parental image remaining partially intact. She absorbs the guilt for the choices that a desperate reality demands. The problem of the stepmother is, at its heart, the problem of a world without enough. Not enough food, not enough security, not enough affection. She is the embodiment of the desperate, zero-sum thinking that scarcity creates. By personifying this unsparing logic in a single cruel figure, the fairy tale creates a focused antagonist the heroine can eventually overcome, allowing for a symbolic triumph over the hostile, competitive world that the stepmother represents. A triumph over the hostile world of the stepmother often led directly to a new frontier of fear. For a young woman in the pre-modern world, the primary escape from the tyranny of her birth family was the arranged marriage. This was a transaction, a bargain made by her father for economic or social gain. It was a journey into a complete unknown, to the home of a man she had likely never met, whose temperament, habits, and desires were a terrifying mystery. The archetype of the beastly groom is the direct embodiment of this pervasive female anxiety. He is the symbolic representation of the unknown husband, a figure whose wealth and status make him a good match on paper, but whose rumored brutishness, strange habits, or violent nature make him a source of terror. The beast is a metaphor for the feral, unpredictable nature of the male stranger to whom a young woman's life is now legally bound. The core of the Beauty and the Beast tale type, ATU 425C, is the process of domesticating this fear. The heroine is trapped in the beast's castle, a place that is both a luxurious prison and a space of discovery. Here, her task is to live with him and to understand him. She must look past the terrifying exterior, the animal hide, the sharp claws, the roaring voice, and find the sorrowful, human man trapped within. This process is a psychological roadmap for acclimation. The heroine's growing comfort and eventual affection for the beast is a narrative that validates the arranged marriage. It provides a potent fantasy that the frightening stranger can be tamed, that his animal nature can be redeemed by a woman's compassion and civility, and that a terrifying bargain can, with time and patience, be transformed into a genuine emotional bond. The story functions as a critical piece of cultural software for a patriarchal society. It acknowledges the legitimate terror a young woman might feel, but it ultimately counsels acceptance and adaptation as the path to security and happiness. By finding the prince inside the beast, the heroine secures her place in her new life, transforming her prison into a kingdom. The tale is an effective tool for reconciling the individual's fear with the unchangeable reality of the social contract. Where some tales seek to reconcile a person to their fears, others serve a much older, harder purpose: to sharpen their teeth. Long before the girl in the red cloak walked a sanitized path, a different version of her story was told around the fires of rural France. It had no famous name, but folklorists call it the story of grandmother. It is the ancestor of the tale we know, and it is a creature of almost unimaginable savagery. The story begins with a bzu, a werewolf, who meets the girl at a crossroads. He asks her which path she is taking to her grandmother's house, the path of needles or the path of pins. This opening riddle is the first clue that we are in a different moral universe. This is a world of initiation and cunning, where choices have immediate, symbolic weight. The girl, in a detail that will become crucial, chooses the slower path, the path of pins, and amuses herself by gathering them as she goes. The Bzu, taking the faster path, arrives at the grandmother's cottage first. Here, the tale descends into absolute darkness. The werewolf does not simply hide the grandmother away. He kills her, drains her blood into a bottle, and slices her flesh onto a platter. He then disposes of her bones in a cupboard, climbs into the grandmother's bed, and waits. Here, the famine wolf is not a metaphor. He is a butcher. The predator's actions are a direct dramatization of the horrors of survival cannibalism. The cottage is transformed from a place of domestic comfort into an abattoir, a trap baited with the flesh of the heroine's own kin. The heroine herself is a different character entirely. She is a nameless peasant girl, defined by her actions, not by the color of her cloak. She is not a naive child who stops to pick flowers. She is a practical girl on an errand who makes a choice that unwittingly gives the predator the time he needs to prepare his horrifying trap. This is the world before the fairy tale was tamed. It is a landscape of pure, functional horror, where the stakes are absolute. The story serves as a visceral, unflinching look at the mechanics of predation and a stark test of the wits a young woman will need to survive in a world where the wolf is already inside the house. The test begins the moment the girl crosses the threshold. When she arrives at the cottage, the Bzu, his voice disguised as her grandmother's, tells her to come inside. He complains of being sick and weak, and immediately offers the girl the meal he has prepared. "Eat some of this meat I have here," he says, "and drink this bottle of wine." The trap, laid with the language of hospitality, is set. The girl, obeying the command of the elder she believes to be her grandmother, sits down to eat. The meat is the flesh of her own kin, and the wine is her blood. This is the horrifying centerpiece of the original tale, a scene of such deep taboo that it was one of the first and most aggressively erased elements when the story was written down. She becomes an unwitting participant in the consumption of her own bloodline. This act transcends simple violence. It is a dark communion. By consuming her grandmother, the girl is unknowingly brought into the wolf's world, a world governed by the unsparing logic of the famine. It is a forced initiation, a symbolic act that obliterates the most sacred bond of kinship. The wolf's desire extends beyond killing her. He first wants to make her like him, to implicate her in his own monstrousness. As she eats, a small cat, a common truth-teller in folklore, appears and cries out a warning. "You slattern," it meows, "to eat the flesh and drink the blood of your own grandmother." The wolf, irritated by this interruption, throws a heavy wooden clog at the cat, killing it. This small, violent act is a fatal mistake. It is the first clue for the girl that the person in the bed is not her grandmother, planting the seed of suspicion that will ultimately save her life. The warning of the animal helper forces the heroine's eyes open. Up to this point, she has been acting under the assumption of a safe, domestic reality. The cat's cry shatters that assumption. It reframes the scene, forcing her to reevaluate every strange detail. The oddly deep voice from the bed, the bizarre meal, and now, the casual, savage violence against a small animal. The spell of normalcy is broken. This scene is the most direct and visceral expression of the famine wolf archetype. In the historical reality of the Great Famine, as we have seen, the ultimate social horror was the disintegration of kinship bonds, where starving neighbors and even family could become predators. This scene is the folkloric enactment of that precise terror. The wolf's goal is to absorb the grandmother's identity and trick the girl into dissolving the boundary between human and food. It is the logic of a world where all social contracts have been rendered meaningless by the overwhelming biological imperative of hunger. The wolf's purpose extends beyond survival. He is performing a ritual of annihilation, destroying a family from the inside out. The horror of this communion lies in its intimacy. The violence shifts from a distant, abstract threat to an intimate one, here at the grandmother's table, served in the grandmother's bowls. By placing the ultimate taboo within the most sacred of domestic spaces, the tale creates a permanent and unforgettable lesson about the true nature of the predator. It teaches that the greatest danger is not the monster you can see, but the one you invite into your home and share a meal with. The monster, having implicated the girl in his feast, now sought to finish his hunt. The bazoo pats the bed beside him and commands her to join him. This is the moment the threat moves from the surreal to the immediate. For the heroine, her mind now sharpened by suspicion, the command is a death sentence. To obey is to die. To refuse is to die. Her only option is to outwit the beast. This is where the famous litany of questions appears, but in this original context, its function is inverted. The questions become a deliberate tactic, a weaponized dialogue designed to stall for time. As she slowly approaches the bed, she begins her interrogation, her voice masking a frantic search for an escape route. "Oh, grandmother, what hairy arms you have," she says, her eyes darting around the dark, unfamiliar room. Each question is a probe, a way to keep the monster talking while she assesses her options. The litany continues, a familiar script played for a deadly purpose. "Oh, grandmother, what long nails you have. Oh, grandmother, what broad shoulders you have." She is not a naive child, marveling at these strange features. She is a survivor gathering data, confirming with each monstrous detail the absolute truth of the cat's warning. The duel of wits reaches its climax. She has circled the bed, her eyes now fixed on the door. She asks the final, fateful question. "Oh, grandmother, what big teeth you have." The wolf, his patience at an end, drops the disguise entirely. He rears up in the bed and roars the famous reply, "The better to eat you with, my child." The trap is sprung, but the girl is ready. In the instant the wolf reveals himself, the girl deploys her brilliant, earthy ruse. "Oh, grandmother," she says with feigned urgency, "I must go outside to relieve myself." The wolf, still savoring his moment of triumph and unwilling to let her go far, agrees, but with a condition. "Do it in the bed," he commands. "Oh no, grandmother," the girl replies. "I cannot do that." The wolf, a creature of appetite, understands physical urges. He relents, but ties a piece of woolen rope to her wrist or ankle, holding the other end to ensure she cannot flee. The girl goes outside into the dark. In a final act of peasant cunning, she quickly unties the rope from her own leg and ties the other end to a nearby plum tree. The wolf, feeling the rope go taut, is fooled into thinking she is still there. It is this small window of time that allows her to slip away into the forest and run for her life. She saves herself. There is no woodcutter, no huntsman, no heroic male rescuer to intervene. Her survival is the direct result of her own sharp wits, her ability to think under pressure and her use of a clever, practical trick. She meets the monster, recognizes it, and engineers her own escape. The escape of the cunning heroine reveals the core logic of the oral tale. It is a worldview built on an unsparing and unsentimental assessment of reality. In this world, there is no cosmic justice, no divine intervention, no expectation of rescue. There is only the predator and the prey who is smart enough to get away. The wolf is treated as a fact of the landscape, a force of nature driven by appetite. He is not judged for his cruelty, and he is not punished for it. The story's focus is entirely on the mechanics of his defeat. Likewise, the heroine's defining quality is not goodness, but competence. She survives because she is attentive, she is a quick-witted trickster, and she has the courage to lie to a monster. Her triumph is a victory of intellect over appetite. This is the logic of a world without saviors, a logic deeply embedded in a peasant reality where authority was distant and justice was something you made for yourself. The story's purpose is to transmit this worldview. It is a piece of utilitarian social software, a lesson designed to install a program of cautious, observant self-reliance in its listener. It teaches that the world is inherently dangerous, that predators will use the language of kinship and hospitality to trap you, and that your own intelligence is your only true weapon. The core, immutable lesson is this: the world is full of intelligent predators, and if you are to survive it, you must be the more intelligent prey. This amoral, stark, and utilitarian landscape is the authentic soil from which the fairy tale grew. And it is this very landscape that will be systematically plowed over, redesigned, and sanitized by the first great literary collectors of these tales. The story of the cunning girl who saves herself was about to be transformed into a story of a foolish girl who needed to be saved. The taming was about to begin. The first great tamer of the folktale was a man who likely never spent a day in a peasant's hovel. Charles Perrault was a product of the absolute pinnacle of French civilization, the court of the Sun King, Louis XIV. He was a high-ranking civil servant, a member of the prestigious French Academy, and a leading intellectual figure in the debates that defined the era. His world was not the dark forest of the oral tradition. It was the glittering, sunlit, and meticulously ordered world of Versailles. This context is everything. Perrault and his contemporaries were engaged in a grand project of cultural refinement. They believed in reason, order, and decorum. They saw their age as the peak of human achievement and looked upon the crude culture of the common people with a mixture of amusement and condescension. For them, a peasant folk tale was like a rough, uncut gemstone, a thing of potential value, but one that needed to be shaped, polished, and set in a sophisticated mounting before it could be truly appreciated. The venue for this polishing was the Parisian Salon. These were elite social gatherings, hosted by aristocratic women, where the best minds of the age came to debate art, literature, and philosophy. In the late 17th century, a fashion for refined, literary fairy tales, or contes de fées, swept through these salons. It was a sophisticated game, a way for authors to showcase their wit and moral insight by taking the raw, brutal stories of the peasantry and retelling them for an educated, aristocratic audience. In 1697, Perrault published his own collection, Histoires ou Contes du Temps Passé, or Tales of Mother Goose. He presented the stories as simple trifles, yet his project was profoundly serious. His goal was to demonstrate that these French tales could be just as instructive and elegant as the classical myths of Greece and Rome. He was, in essence, claiming these stories for the national literary canon. To do this, he had to transform them. The amoral logic of the oral tradition, with its focus on cunning and survival, was wholly unsuitable for his audience. The salon demanded stories that reinforced the social and moral codes of their own class. A tale had to have a clear, didactic purpose. It needed to instruct young ladies on proper behavior, warn them against social dangers, and uphold the patriarchal and aristocratic values of the day. Perrault, therefore, acted as a cultural filter. He took the unsparing utilitarian tale of the cunning girl and the famine wolf and began a process of systematic alteration. He would strip the story of its most shocking elements, infuse it with a new set of values, and attach an explicit, written moral to the end, ensuring that its new purpose could never be mistaken. He was about to turn a survival guide into a lesson on etiquette. The first step in turning a survival guide into a lesson on etiquette is to change the heroine's costume. The nameless, practical peasant girl of the oral tradition is banished. In her place, Perrault creates a pretty little village girl, a child so beloved that her mother has a special garment made for her, a chaperone rouge, a little red hood. This is the single most important addition to the story, a literary invention that redefines the main character before she even speaks a word. This is not a piece of authentic peasant clothing. A bright red dye, especially one made from cochineal, was an expensive luxury item in the 17th century. To dress a child in such a garment for a walk through the woods is an act of bourgeois indulgence. It immediately signals that this girl is from a world of comfort, a world where practicality is secondary to appearance. The color itself was a deliberate and loaded symbolic choice. For a 17th century audience, the color red carried a potent and dualistic meaning. It was the color of sin, of worldly passions, and of forbidden transgression, sometimes worn by women of ill repute to signal their trade. At the same time, it was the color of rebellion and defiance against social order. To wear a bright red garment was to draw attention to oneself, to make a flagrant statement of vanity. This seemingly innocent piece of clothing is, in fact, the story's new original sin. The girl is now marked, from the very beginning, as a figure of questionable virtue. Her red hood makes her conspicuous, a flash of scarlet against the green of the forest. It acts as a lure, attracting the attention of the wolf. Perrault's story subtly implies that her vanity is the cause of her downfall. She is targeted because she stands out. The wolf is also transformed, shedding the skin of the savage, cannibalistic werewolf. Perrault's wolf becomes a smooth talker, a compere, or gossip. He is a suave, charming predator who uses flattery and polite conversation to trick the girl into revealing her destination. This is a wolf designed for the salon, a symbol not of primal hunger, but of the sophisticated, predatory gentleman that a well-to-do young woman might encounter in polite society. The encounter between this new wolf and the girl in her new clothes is a complete reframing of the conflict. The original tale's focus on raw survival is gone. In its place is a social drama, a cautionary tale about the dangers of female vanity and the risks of conversing with charming but untrustworthy men. By simply adding one piece of clothing, Perrault fundamentally alters the moral calculus of the story. The heroine is no longer a competent agent in a dangerous world. She is now a flawed, vain, and overly trusting child who bears a measure of responsibility for the catastrophe that is about to befall her. Her bright red hood is a target, painted on her by her own vanity, and Perrault is about to make her pay the price for it. To ensure his flawed heroine pays the price for her vanity, Charles Perrault had to strip her of her only defense. He had to erase her cunning. The sharp, observant, and quick-witted survivor of the oral tradition is systematically dismantled, and in her place is constructed a new model of girlhood, one defined by politeness, obedience, and a fatal lack of curiosity. The changes are absolute. The brutal, cannibalistic feast is completely removed. In Perrault's version, the wolf simply tells the girl that the grandmother is in bed. He then issues the same chilling command to get into bed with him. In a direct and shocking contrast to the oral heroine, this new girl obeys. Her social training to do as adults tell her overrides any sense of suspicion or self-preservation. The famous dialogue of questions, which the oral heroine used as a weaponized stalling tactic, is now returned to its more familiar function as a display of catastrophic naivete. She lies in bed next to the predator, remarking on his hairy arms and big ears with a kind of clueless wonder. She is a passive observer of her own doom, a specimen under the wolf's microscope, and her questions only serve to underline her complete helplessness. Most critically, the escape is removed. The clever, utilitarian ruse of needing to relieve herself, the very trick that defined the oral heroine's agency, is unthinkable for Perrault's well-bred little girl. Such a display of peasant pragmatism would be unseemly and indecorous for a character meant for the salon. The door to self-reliance is locked and barred by the rules of etiquette. Because she has been stripped of her wits, her ending is absolute. In Perrault's telling, the story concludes the moment she is consumed. The grandmother is gone, the girl is gone, and the wolf triumphs completely. This bleak, unsparing ending is the entire point of Perrault's exercise. The cunning heroine of the oral tradition, a figure who represented self-reliance and the intelligence of the common folk, was an unsuitable model for the young ladies of the aristocracy. Perrault's goal was to teach a different lesson. He needed a heroine who was a cautionary example, a girl whose tragic fate was a direct consequence of her disobedience and naivete. The erasure of the heroine's cunning is therefore a deliberate and necessary act of ideological surgery. He removes her agency to create a vacuum, and into that vacuum he will insert his own explicit moral. He transforms the story from a celebration of female intelligence into a sobering warning about the consequences of female foolishness. In Perrault's hands, the tale becomes a tool for social conditioning. It teaches that a girl's primary virtues are obedience and suspicion of strangers, not cleverness and self-reliance. By silencing the cunning heroine, he paves the way for a new model of femininity, one that is defined by its passivity and its ultimate dependence on the very rules it has failed to obey. Charles Perrault was so determined that his new lesson be understood that he left nothing to chance. He refused to allow the story to be misinterpreted. After the bleak final line, where the wolf consumes the girl, Perrault appends a formal, poetic moralité. He steps out from behind the curtain of the storyteller and addresses his intended audience of young, aristocratic ladies directly, spelling out the precise meaning they are to take from his sobering creation. The moral begins by stating the obvious, that children, especially pretty and well-bred young girls, should never speak to strangers, or they might end up as dinner for a wolf. Had he stopped there, it would be a simple cautionary tale. But he does not stop there. He clarifies that there are many different kinds of wolves. The most dangerous wolf, he explains, is the one who is charming, quiet, polite, unassuming, complacent, and sweet. He is the wolf who follows young ladies right into their homes and their chambers. With this final flourish, the wolf sheds his final skin as a famine symbol or a literal animal. He is explicitly redefined as a specific type of human predator, the suave, sophisticated courtier, the seductive gentleman. With this final explanation, Perrault's project is complete. The story of Grandmother, an unsparing tale of survival from the peasant oral tradition, has been fully colonized and repurposed. It is now a story designed to police the social conduct and moral virtue of upper-class young women. Its new purpose is to instill a deep-seated fear of male predators who use charm and flattery as their weapons. The cunning peasant girl who saved herself has been sacrificed to create a new kind of heroine, the beautiful, foolish victim. Her death is a necessary warning to the girls of the salon. It teaches them that their virtue is fragile, that their judgment is untrustworthy, and that a single act of disobedience or misplaced trust can lead to a swift and irreversible social, and even literal, death. This is the version of the tale that would enter the literary canon. Perrault's immense cultural authority ensured that his polished, didactic, and deeply misogynistic retelling would become the dominant strain. He had captured the wolf, but in the process, he had put the heroine in a cage, one built from the bars of etiquette, obedience, and fear. The taming was complete. Perrault's taming, however, was not the final word. More than a century after his bleak moral tale was published, in a Europe convulsed by the Napoleonic Wars, two German brothers would take up his story and reshape it once more. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were linguists, philologists, and librarians, and their life's work was driven by a potent idea that was sweeping across the fragmented German states: romantic nationalism. This was the belief that a true nation, a Volk, was defined by its shared language, culture, and traditions. In a Germany that was a patchwork of squabbling kingdoms, occupied by the French and lacking a unified identity, the Grimms believed the soul of their people lay dormant in the old stories, the Märchen told by the common folk. Their project was an act of cultural archaeology, to excavate and preserve these tales as the authentic, unifying voice of the German spirit. They saw the forest of German folklore as a sacred place, a repository of ancient wisdom and national character. They believed they were acting as faithful scribes, simply writing down the pure, unvarnished stories they were told by German peasants. For decades, this image of the Grimms as humble collectors, listening at the feet of wise old storytellers, defined their legacy. The reality, however, was more complex. The Grimms' primary sources were not, in fact, grizzled, unlettered peasants. They were often young, educated, middle-class women from their own social circle. And many of these women, like the Huguenot-descended Hassenpflug family, who provided them with numerous tales, were intimately familiar with the French literary tradition. They were telling the Grimm stories they had read in books, specifically the works of Charles Perrault. The brothers, therefore, were often unknowingly recording German adaptations of French literary tales. Their collection, the Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Children's and Household Tales, first published in 1812, was a complex synthesis. It was a blend of genuine German oral fragments, stories from their middle-class informants, and heavily edited versions of tales that had already been filtered through the French aristocratic salon. Their project shifted from simple preservation to active creation and curation. The brothers edited, rewrote, and blended versions of the stories across 7 different editions, published over more than 4 decades. Their goal evolved to create a collection of tales that functioned as a proper book of upbringing, a text that could instill the correct moral virtues, piety, obedience, submission to authority in the children of the rising German middle class. They were about to retame the wolf, this time for the nursery. To retame the wolf for their new middle-class audience, the Grimms acted as master weavers. They took the core narrative thread from the version of the story they received from their informants, a story that was already heavily indebted to Charles Perrault, and decided its bleak, tragic ending was unsuitable for a book meant for children. They needed a different conclusion, one that offered restoration and justice, and they found it in another, entirely separate German folktale. This tale was The Wolf and the 7 Young Goats, ATU 123, a story with which they were intimately familiar. In this tale, a mother goat warns her 7 children not to open the door while she is away. A wolf, disguising his voice, tricks the young goats into letting him in and promptly swallows 6 of them whole. The 7th goat hides in the grandfather clock and survives to tell the mother what happened. The mother goat finds the wolf sleeping off his meal. Seeing his stomach moving, she correctly deduces that her children are still alive inside. She fetches a pair of scissors, cuts open the wolf's belly, and her 6 children emerge, completely unharmed. This moment of miraculous rebirth is the key element the Grimms needed. The Grimms took this entire sequence and performed a direct literary transplant. They took the ending of The Wolf and the 7 Young Goats and stitched it onto the end of Perrault's Le Petit Chaperon Rouge. In their new tale, which they called Rotkäppchen, or Little Redcap, the wolf swallows the grandmother and the girl whole, exactly as Perrault's had. But now, their fate is not final. This act of synthesis solves Perrault's central problem. His ending was morally instructive, but far too bleak for the nursery. By importing this new conclusion, the Grimms could have it both ways. They could retain the terrifying sequence of the girl being eaten, satisfying the need for a dramatic climax, but they could immediately undo it with a miraculous rescue that restored the natural order. They also imported the second part of the goat's tale, the punishment. After freeing her children, the mother goat fills the wolf's belly with heavy stones. When the wolf awakens and tries to drink from a well, the weight of the stones pulls him in and he drowns. This provides a satisfyingly gruesome end for the villain, one that was conspicuously absent from both the oral tradition and Perrault's version. This new synthesized story was a masterful act of narrative engineering. It combined the memorable characters and social warnings of the French literary version with the miraculous restoration and violent justice of the German oral tradition. But in performing this synthesis, the Grimms made one final crucial addition, an invention all their own that would cement the tale's meaning for the next 200 years. That final, cementing addition was a new character. In The Wolf and the 7 Young Goats, The rescuer was the mother, a capable female figure who single-handedly saves her own children. For the brothers Grimm, this was an unsuitable hero for their Rotkäppchen. To perform the miraculous rescue, they invented a new agent of justice, a figure who appears from nowhere at the perfect moment, guided by his own moral intuition, the huntsman. This character is a true deus ex machina, a god from the machine who arrives to solve an unsolvable problem. In the Grimm's telling, the huntsman is passing the grandmother's cottage and hears the wolf's loud snoring. Thinking the old woman might be in distress, he decides to investigate. His presence is a complete coincidence, a narrative intervention designed to provide the rescue that the heroine is now too passive and helpless to perform herself. Upon entering the cottage, he finds the wolf sleeping in the grandmother's bed. He is about to shoot the beast when it occurs to him that the wolf might have swallowed the grandmother whole and that she might yet be saved. This is the crucial moment. The huntsman's actions are intelligent, compassionate, and almost surgical. He chooses the scissors over the gun. He takes a pair of scissors, cuts open the sleeping wolf's belly, and just as in the tale of the goats, little Redcap and her grandmother emerge, miraculously unharmed. The darkness is reversed, the victims are reborn, and the natural order is fully restored. The tale has been transformed from a bleak tragedy into a story of triumphant rescue. The invention of the huntsman is the single most consequential ideological choice the brothers Grimm make. He is the embodiment of a specific kind of authority, benevolent, competent, and exclusively male. He represents the protective mantle of the established social order, where the oral heroine had to rely on her own wits, and Perrault's heroine was punished for her lack of them. The Grimm's heroine is saved by the timely intervention of a good man who knows what to do. His arrival fundamentally changes the story's core lesson. The oral tale's moral was be clever. Perrault's moral was be obedient, or you will die. The new implicit moral of the Grimm's version is, if you are a good and innocent child who makes a mistake, a righteous man will appear to save you from the consequences. This is the fantasy that has defined the last 2 centuries of the tale. The huntsman is the ancestor of every hero who arrives in the nick of time. He is the comforting promise that the world is, in fact, overseen by a just and capable patriarchal authority, an authority that will protect the innocent and punish the wicked. By creating this character, the Grimms completed the process of domestication. They took Perrault's passive victim and gave her a savior, locking in a vision of female helplessness that would become the standard for fairy tales for generations. The cunning girl was dead, the tragic victim was redeemed, and in their place now stood the innocent child, forever in need of rescue. This innocent child represents the final stage in a critical ideological evolution. The journey of this one folktale, from the firesides of medieval France to the nurseries of 19th century Germany, is a case study in how stories are wrestled into the shape of a culture's dominant values. The heroine's transformation was a necessary casualty of that process. The cunning heroine of the oral tradition was the product of a world that valued female competence and pragmatism. She was a survivor. Perrault's heroine was the product of an aristocratic salon that sought to police female behavior. She was a tragic example. But the Grimm's heroine was the perfect product of a new, bourgeois ideal of childhood itself. She was an emblem of pure innocence. This concept of childhood innocence, the idea of children as fundamentally different beings from adults who must be protected from all harm and knowledge, was a potent and relatively new idea in the 19th century. The Grimm's version of the tale triumphed globally because it perfectly served this new ideal. Its heroine is a creature of pure goodness who makes a single, childish mistake. Her rescue and the wolf's punishment provide the perfect, morally unambiguous resolution that this new vision of the world required. The focus of the story shifts from the girl's abilities, or even her failings, to her innate status as a precious and vulnerable object to be protected. Her helplessness becomes her defining virtue. It is this very helplessness that summons the huntsman, that justifies the intervention of the patriarchal order, and that allows for the perfect restoration of a world where innocent children are kept safe by strong, good men. This triumph of helplessness had consequences that rippled out far beyond this single story. The Grimm's Little Red Cap became a foundational text for the modern fairy tale. It provided the blueprint for a new kind of heroine, one whose primary role was to be imperiled and then rescued. Her passivity, her innocence, and her ultimate reliance on an external male savior became the default characteristics of the fairy tale princess. The taming of this one ancient, unsparing story was complete. The famine wolf of the oral tradition had been slain, but so had the cunning girl who once outwitted him. In her place, a sanitized, simplified, and profoundly influential icon was born. Her red cloak became a uniform of innocence, and her story became a comforting promise that no matter how far you stray from the path, a hero will always be there to bring you home. This investigation reveals how a story can be a battlefield, where competing visions of the world, of women, and of childhood itself fight for dominance. The version that survives is the one that best serves the dominant ideology of its time. But this is just one case file. To understand the true depth and breadth of this process, we must open another and examine the haunting truth behind a girl defined not by a red cloak, but by a lost slipper. The story of the lost slipper, the cruel stepmother, and the triumphant persecuted heroine feels like a cornerstone of European culture. But its deepest roots lie elsewhere. Nearly 1,000 years before Charles Perrault put the tale to paper in France, a Chinese official named Duan Chengxi recorded a story told to him by a servant from the south. Preserved in an 850 AD collection of strange tales, it is the story of Ye Xian, and it is the oldest known version of Cinderella in the world. Ye Xian, like her European counterpart, is an orphan of great beauty and kindness who is abused by her cruel stepmother. Her only friend is a magnificent fish with golden eyes, which she secretly raises in a nearby pond. The fish is her confidant, a magical creature who recognizes her true worth. But the stepmother discovers the secret, tricks the fish, and kills it for dinner, burying its bones beneath a dung heap. This is where the story's unique magic begins. As Ye Xian weeps for her murdered friend, the spirit of the fish appears to her. It instructs her to retrieve its bones and hide them in her room. The bones, it explains, are now a potent magical talisman that will grant her any wish she desires. This is the story's version of the fairy godmother, a source of power born directly from the heroine's love and loss. When the local cave festival approaches, a time for young people to meet and find partners, the stepmother forbids Ye Xian from attending. Desperate, Ye Xian prays to the fish bones. She is instantly granted a magnificent costume of kingfisher feathers and a pair of tiny, impossibly beautiful slippers woven from golden thread. The bones grant her a stark transformation, encompassing her beauty and allowing her to briefly enter the world of high society. At the festival, Ye Xian is the center of attention, but she lives in fear of being discovered by her stepfamily. In her haste to leave, she loses one of the golden slippers. A local villager finds it and eventually sells it to a merchant, and through a chain of trade, the slipper makes its way to the king of a prosperous island kingdom. The king is fascinated by the slipper. It is so small that no woman in his own court can fit her foot inside. Intrigued, he commands a kingdom-wide search, vowing to marry the woman who is its rightful owner. The slipper is displayed in a pavilion by the roadside, and after a long search, Ye Xian is finally brought forward. When she puts on the slipper, the magical kingfisher feather robe reappears, revealing her true identity and her otherworldly beauty. The king marries Ye Xian and takes her back to his kingdom. The cruel stepmother and her daughters meet a harsher fate than in many later versions. They are left behind and eventually killed by flying stones that collapse their cave home. Ye Xian's story establishes the complete core blueprint of the tale nearly a millennium before the Grimm's version. The persecuted heroine, the magical helper, the transformative costume, the lost token, the shoe-based identity test, and the royal marriage that restores the heroine to her rightful status. The blueprint established by Ye Xian was a story too resonant to remain in one place. It was a perfect narrative seed, containing a core of injustice and vindication that could take root in the soil of any culture. Folklorists have identified hundreds of distinct versions of the ATU 510A tale type, an ocean of stories stretching from Scotland to Japan, from India to Africa. The tale's migratory path is a testament to its universal appeal. The core theme appeared in fragments even in the ancient world. The Greek historian Strabo, in the 1st century BC, tells the story of Rhodopis, a Greek slave girl in Egypt whose sandal is snatched by an eagle. The eagle flies to the city of Memphis and drops the sandal in the lap of the pharaoh, who, struck by its beauty and the strangeness of the event, launches a search for its owner and makes her his queen upon finding her. This is a proto-Cinderella, a hint of the theme's deep antiquity. But the first great European literary version, a tale far darker and stranger than the one we know, emerges from the vibrant and volatile world of 17th century Naples. In 1634, an Italian courtier and poet named Giambattista Basile published a collection of earthy, bawdy, and often unsparing folk tales called the Pentamerone, and within it was the story of La Gatta Cenerentola, the cat Cinderella. Basile's heroine, Zezolla, is an active agent in her own story. Tormented by her stepmother, she conspires with her seemingly kind governess. At the governess's suggestion, Zezolla murders her stepmother by breaking her neck with the lid of a heavy chest. She then convinces her father to marry the governess, believing her life will improve. This act of violence is a shocking departure from the gentle heroines we know, a reminder of the unsentimental nature of the older tales. Of course, the governess, once married, reveals her own true nature, bringing in her own 6 daughters and casting Zezolla into servitude, forcing her to live by the hearth and renaming her cat Cinderella. It is from here that the more familiar elements emerge: a magical date tree that provides her with fine clothes, a king who falls in love with her at a feast, and the famous lost slipper, in this case a pianella, a stilted overshoe of the era. Basile's version is crucial. It stands as a major literary anchor for the tale in Europe. 2 generations before Perrault would write his own, far more sanitized version. It demonstrates that even within Europe, the story of the girl in the cinders was a fluid tradition that could be adapted for different audiences, capable of containing both shocking violence and magical redemption. From the Greco-Egyptian slave girl to the murderous Neapolitan, from the Iroquois tale of the rough-faced girl to the Vietnamese story of Tam and Cam, the core pattern repeats. A heroine of unrecognized worth is abused by her family, receives supernatural aid, is magically transformed, loses a unique item of footwear, and is ultimately recognized and elevated by a powerful man. This global ubiquity reveals the story to be a fundamental human myth, a narrative machine for exploring envy, justice, and the fantasy of a world where intrinsic value, no matter how much it is soiled and abused, can be recognized and rewarded in the end. The glass slipper is just one local variant of a truly universal emblem. Before the slipper, there is the hearth. Across hundreds of versions of the tale, this is the one constant, the universal starting point. The heroine is defined, and often named, by her forced intimacy with the dirtiest place in the house. In Germany, she is Aschenputtel, the ash fool. In Italy, she is Cenerentola, the cinder wench. In France, she is Cendrillon, the little cinder. Her very identity is bound to the ashes. This connection to the hearth is a potent, dual symbol. On the one hand, it marks her as the lowest of the low. She is the one who must tend the fires, sleep in the warmest spot she can find, and is permanently marked by the soot and grime of her labor. She is a figure of absolute domestic servitude, a living embodiment of dirt and debasement. On the other hand, the hearth is the absolute center of the home. It is the source of warmth, the place where food is cooked, the nucleus around which the entire family gathers. By placing the heroine in the cinders, the story paradoxically positions her at the very heart of the domestic world from which she is emotionally excluded. She is an outcast who is also the symbolic center, a figure of deep liminality. This hearth-stained outcast is the story's true engine. She is the living representation of unrecognized virtue. Her goodness, her beauty, and her fundamental worth are all present, but they are hidden beneath a layer of grime, rendered invisible to her abusive family. The stepsisters, with their fine clothes and privileged position, represent the triumph of external status over internal quality. The central drama of the tale, in every culture, is the process of making this hidden worth visible. The beautiful gown is a revelation, the truest reflection of who she has been all along. The ashes were the disguise. The magical transformation is the moment where the heroine's exterior is finally made to match her interior. This archetype of the noble in rags is the source of the story's incredible endurance. It speaks to a fundamental human desire for a just world, a world where the good and the worthy, however oppressed, are eventually seen and elevated. The girl in the cinders is a permanent symbol of hope for anyone who has ever felt undervalued, unseen, or defined by a situation that is beneath them. She is the promise that true value, like a glowing ember, can survive even when buried in the ash. In the version of the tale codified by the brothers Grimm, the ash is piled high indeed. Their heroine, Aschenputtel, inhabits a world of heightened, almost theatrical cruelty. Her story begins with a deathbed promise to her mother to remain pious and good. It is this piety, her devotion to her mother's memory, that becomes the source of her unique magic. The magical helper in this tale is a hazel tree that Aschenputtel plants on her mother's grave, watering it with her own tears. 3 times a day, she goes to the grave to weep and pray, and a little white bird that lives in the tree becomes her sole confidant and the agent of her wishes. The magic here is rooted in grief, devotion, and a direct connection to the spirit of her dead matriarch. This connection is her only solace in a home defined by relentless psychological abuse. The Grimm's version is famous for the detail and specificity of its cruelty. The stepsisters, described as beautiful on the outside but black-hearted within, escalate their abuse beyond simple overwork into acts of calculated sadism. They steal her fine clothes, force her to wear rags, and make her sleep in the hearth. The most famous example of this is the task of the lentils. When Aschenputtel begs to go to the king's festival, the stepmother dumps a bowl of lentils into the ashes of the hearth and tells her she can go only if she can sort the good from the bad in 2 hours. It is a task designed to be impossible, a deliberate act of psychological torture meant to extinguish all hope. It is only with the help of the magical birds from her mother's grave that she is able to succeed. The cruelty of the Grimm's tale is sharper, more personal, and more relentless than in many other versions. It serves a specific, didactic purpose for their 19th century bourgeois audience. By making Aschenputtel the model of a perfectly pious, patient, and long-suffering daughter, and by making the step-family the embodiment of unmotivated, vile-hearted evil, they create a stark and simple moral universe. This is a world where goodness is defined by endurance, and where the stage is set for an equally stark and unforgiving form of justice. The unforgiving justice of the Grimm's tale arrives with the prince and a golden slipper. In this version, the slipper is not glass, but gold, an object of pure, uncorruptible value. When the prince arrives at the house, he is met first by the beautiful stepsisters. The eldest takes the slipper to her room, but her foot is too large. Her mother, the arch-villain of the story, hands her a knife and speaks a line of cold, transactional cruelty. Cut off your toe. When you are queen, you will no longer have to go on foot. The daughter, convinced by this unsparing logic, mutilates herself, forces her bloody foot into the slipper, and is presented to the prince. Deceived, he lifts her onto his horse and begins to ride away toward the castle. This moment is the pinnacle of their deception, a temporary triumph bought with blood and a lie. It is here that the story's true magical force intervenes. As they ride past the graveyard, the 2 white birds in the hazel tree on Aschenputtel's mother's grave cry out a warning for the prince to hear. Rook de goo, rook de goo. There's blood in the shoe. The shoe is too tight. This is not the right bride. The birds are the voice of the pious mother, agents of a truth that cannot be suppressed by ambition or violence. The prince, alerted, looks down and sees the blood streaming from the shoe. He realizes he has been tricked, turns his horse around, and returns the false bride to her home in disgrace. The second sister is then summoned. Her foot is also too large, but her heel is the problem. The mother again hands her the knife with the same cold command. cut off a piece of your heel. When you are queen, you will no longer have to go on foot. The second sister mutilates herself, forces her foot into the slipper, and the deception is repeated. And again, as they ride past the hazel tree, the magical birds cry out their warning. The prince discovers the blood, and the second false bride is returned. The slipper, as an instrument of truth, has exposed their lies through the very violence they committed to conceal them. This sequence of deception, mutilation, and magical revelation is the narrative and moral core of the Grimm's version. The violence serves a direct purpose. It is a dramatization of the sisters' inner ugliness. Their willingness to carve up their own bodies in pursuit of status is the ultimate physical manifestation of their black-hearted ambition. They are so desperate for the external trapping of royalty, the shoe, that they will destroy a part of themselves to get it. After returning the second false bride, the prince finally asks the question the family has dreaded. Have you no other daughter? The father, weak and complicit, mentions only the stunted little kitchen wench, Aschenputtel. She is summoned, and despite her filthy state, her beauty is undeniable. The golden slipper fits her as if it were made for her. In that moment, the prince recognizes the beautiful stranger from the festival and claims her as his true bride. The story then moves to its final act, the wedding. The two stepsisters, defeated but ever opportunistic, decide to attend the ceremony. They seek to curry favor with their newly powerful stepsister and share in her good fortune. They walk with the bridal couple, one on the right and one on the left, feigning friendship and acting as bridesmaids. But the agents of justice have not forgotten their crimes. As the procession enters the church, the two avenging white birds, the same birds that revealed their deception, descend from Aschenputtel's shoulders. They fly at the eldest sister, the one on the right, and peck out her right eye. They then fly at the younger sister, on the left, and peck out her left eye. The punishment is a masterpiece of chilling symmetry. Later, as the wedding party exits the church, the birds descend again. They attack the eldest sister, now on the left, and peck out her remaining left eye. They attack the younger sister, now on the right, and peck out her remaining right eye. The Grimm's final line is stark and unsparing. And thus, for their wickedness and falsehood, they were punished with blindness for the rest of their days. This final punishment is lex talionis, the law of retaliation, in its purest form. It is the principle of an eye for an eye, delivered with a terrifying literalness. The punishment is not arbitrary. It is designed to perfectly fit the crime. The sisters use their eyes to look upon Aschenputtel with scorn and envy, and to see her only as an object of contempt. For this sin of sight, they lose their own. Their external state of blindness is now a perfect match for their internal, moral blindness. The justice of the tale is absolute and unnervingly precise. The unnervingly precise justice of the Grimm's tale provides a satisfying, visceral conclusion. But the story's true power, its enduring function across 1,000 years and 100 cultures, is found in its ultimate prize. Modern audiences have been trained to see this prize as romantic love. The unsettling truth, however, is that the original story is about something far more utilitarian and urgent. It is about the acquisition of status and security, and the prince is merely the vehicle for that acquisition. This is the reality of the historical marriage bargain. For the vast majority of human history, and especially for the women of the pre-modern world, Marriage was the single most important economic and social transaction of their lives. It was a strategic alliance between families, a mechanism for consolidating property, securing bloodlines, and ensuring a woman's basic survival. A young, unmarried woman, particularly one without a dowry like our heroine, occupied a position of extreme vulnerability. She was often seen as little more than a dependent, a financial burden on her family. Her labor was unpaid, her future was uncertain, and her social standing was non-existent. Her personal qualities, her kindness, her intelligence, her beauty, were her only potential assets in a ruthless marketplace. Her life paths were starkly limited. She could enter a convent, dedicating her life to the church. She could remain unmarried, living as a dependent spinster in the household of a brother or other male relative. Or she could marry. For most, marriage was the only path that offered the possibility of her own household, her own children, and a measure of social standing. The Cinderella story, in all its global variations, is a potent dramatization of this very calculus. The festival or ball functions as a marriage market, the one place where the heroine can display her intrinsic assets to an audience of eligible men. Her magical transformation is what allows her to enter this market and compete. The prince, therefore, is the ultimate prize in this market. He is more than a handsome man. He is the living embodiment of absolute security. To marry him is to escape servitude, to leapfrog the social hierarchy, and to gain a permanent, unassailable position of power and safety. He is a walking emblem of total vindication. Deconstructing the story in this way does not diminish its power. It reveals its true, unsentimental core. It is a story that acknowledges the unsparing, transactional reality of a woman's world and provides the ultimate fantasy of escape. It is the fantasy of one's true, hidden value being recognized and rewarded with the one thing that truly mattered: a secure place in the world. To understand the desperate need for a secure place in the world, one must first analyze the economics of the hearth. For the girl in the cinders, her role as the unloved stepdaughter is inseparable from her economic function as an unpaid servant. She is a source of free labor in a household that has stripped her of all inheritance and all prospects. Her daily life, as detailed in the Grimm's version, is a litany of backbreaking tasks. She is the first to rise and the last to sleep. She hauls the water, lights the fire, cooks the meals, scrubs the floors, does the laundry, and endures the constant cruel demands of her stepfamily. She is, in modern terms, a victim of domestic trafficking, a slave within her own home. Her name, Aschenputtel or Cinderella, transcends a cruel taunt. It functions as a brand. It is a constant verbal reminder of her economic status. By tying her identity to the dirtiest part of the house, her family reinforces her role as a creature of service, someone who belongs to the grime and has no right to the clean, privileged spaces of the home. This economic nullity is the source of the story's central injustice. The heroine performs all the labor that keeps the household running, yet she reaps none of its benefits. She creates the warmth, but must sleep in the cold. She cooks the food, but eats only the scraps. Her sisters use the wealth generated by the household, wealth her labor helps maintain, to buy fine clothes and attend festivals, while she is denied the basic dignity of a proper dress. The famous task of sorting the lentils from the ash is a perfect metaphor for her economic condition. Her stepmother takes a valuable resource, food, and deliberately renders it worthless by mixing it with filth. She then commands the heroine to restore the value to this resource through an impossible amount of unpaid labor. This is the daily reality of Aschenputtel's life, distilled into a single, sadistic act. Her situation is a trap with no conventional exit. She has no wages to save. She has no property or dowry to attract a respectable husband from her own class. She has no family to advocate for her. From a purely rational, economic standpoint, her future is a flat line, destined to continue in this state of servitude until she is too old to work, at which point she would be cast out entirely. This is the grim reality that fuels the fantasy. The desperation of her situation is what makes the magical intervention so necessary, and the prize of the prince so transformative. The story is not about a girl who wants a prettier dress. It is about a girl in a state of absolute economic bondage, who requires a miracle to escape a life of endless, uncompensated toil. The cruelty of the stepmother and the beauty of the heroine are the story's moral window dressing. The engine that drives the entire narrative is the unsparing, unspoken truth of the hearth. It is a core economic lesson. In this world, for a woman without property or protectors, her labor has no value, and therefore, neither does she. Into a world where a woman without property is worth nothing, the story introduces a figure who owns everything. The prince is the absolute counterpoint to the heroine's economic nullity. He is the ultimate symbol of status, wealth, and security. He is less a character and more a destination, the one and only force in the world capable of instantly and permanently reversing the heroine's desperate equation. The modern, romantic reading of the story assumes the prince falls in love with the heroine's inner qualities. The colder logic of the original tales suggests he falls for the only thing he is able to see, the magical illusion of status she projects at the ball. He is captivated by the mysterious, high-ranking princess in the magnificent gown, a woman who appears to be his social equal. He falls in love with the perfect packaging. The slipper test, in this context, shifts from a search for a soulmate to a verification of an asset. The slipper is a piece of magical evidence, a token that proves this beautiful stranger actually exists. The prince's obsession with finding its owner is the obsession of a collector seeking a rare prize. The search is a public demonstration of his sovereignty, his ability to mobilize the entire kingdom to satisfy his personal desire. The marriage itself is the story's ultimate economic act. It is a transaction of unparalleled scale. For the prince, the marriage costs him nothing and gains him a beautiful queen. For the heroine, it is a moment of total and absolute transformation. In the instant she is recognized as the true owner of the slipper, she is teleported from the very bottom of the social and economic ladder to its absolute summit. She is no longer an unpaid servant. She is now the mistress of a castle, the commander of her own servants. She is no longer a figure of contempt, but a figure of authority. She is no longer dependent on the scraps from her stepmother's table. She now controls the wealth of a kingdom. The marriage is a social and economic elevator, moving her from the basement to the penthouse in a single, magical ascent. This is the core fantasy that fuels the myth's enduring appeal. The prince is the agent of this fantasy. His love is the catalyst, but the result is a fundamental change in material and social conditions. He is the miracle that breaks the bonds of her servitude. The story, therefore, is an instruction manual on the utility of the marriage bargain. It teaches that a woman's intrinsic worth, if packaged correctly and displayed in the right market, can be exchanged for a life of unimaginable security. The prince himself is the vehicle, while the life he unlocks is the true prize. He is the key, and the kingdom is the door. The fantasy of unlocking a new life with the key of a royal marriage is the enduring heart of the Cinderella story. It is a narrative of deep wish fulfillment, one that speaks to a fundamental human desire for the world to be just. It is the fantasy that the universe has a moral arc, and that it eventually bends toward the deserving. The heroine's entire journey is a validation of inner nobility. She does not win her prize by changing who she is, but by enduring until the world is forced to recognize who she has been all along. Unlike the stepsisters, who must physically carve themselves up to fit a role they do not deserve, the heroine's worth is proven by the effortless fit of the slipper. The slipper confirms her identity. It does not create it. This makes the story a powerful fantasy of recognition. The prince's search is a search for a hidden truth. His kingdom-wide test is a declaration that status, wealth, and the opinions of a cruel family are irrelevant in the face of true, intrinsic value. The story is a fantasy about the world itself reorienting to acknowledge and reward your inherent worth, regardless of your current circumstances. The romantic element provides the socially acceptable packaging for this deeper, more radical fantasy. The love of the prince is the magical catalyst that makes the just world possible. It provides a personal, emotional reason for the immense force of social and economic reordering that is the story's true climax. This is why the tale has endured for over a millennium, spreading to every corner of the earth. Its core promise is elemental. It tells us that the squalor of the hearth is temporary. It tells us that the cruelty of the unjust is ultimately impotent. It tells us that true nobility is a quality of the soul, not the station, and that one day, a magical force, be it a prince, a fish spirit, or a bird in a tree, will arrive to prove it. The story of the girl in the cinders is the ultimate fantasy of a just reward. It is a myth that assures us that however bleak our world may seem, our hidden value is real, and one day the shoe will fit, our worth will be seen, and we will be lifted out of the ash and into the light. The promise of being lifted out of the ash remains a potent one. But in a modern world, where the literal threat of famine has receded and the marriage bargain has been replaced by notions of romantic love, why do these ancient stories still haunt us? Why does the wolf in the forest still feel so menacing and the girl in the cinders so familiar? In the early 20th century, a new school of thought emerged that offered a revolutionary answer. It was the birth of psychoanalysis. Led by pioneers like Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis proposed a new map of the human mind. It argued that our conscious thoughts and actions were merely the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface lay the vast, deep, and turbulent ocean of the unconscious, a realm of repressed desires, primal fears, and potent, instinctual drives. For Freud, our dreams and myths were the coded language of this hidden world. Freud saw the fairy tales through the lens of his developmental theories. He interpreted them as highly compressed dramas about the anxieties of the nuclear family, the Oedipal conflict, sibling rivalry, and the turbulent transition into adulthood were, in his view, the true subjects of these seemingly innocent stories. The archetypal wolf for Freud, became a transparent symbol for a dangerous and predatory masculine force, and Little Red Riding Hood's journey into the woods was a story of a young girl's risky dalliance with the forbidden and the unknown. Freud's student and eventual rival, Carl Jung, took this idea in a different direction. For Jung, the unconscious extended beyond a personal cellar of repressed memories. He argued for the existence of a collective unconscious, a deeper, shared layer of the psyche common to all of humanity. This collective unconscious, he believed, was populated by archetypes, universal, primordial patterns and images that are the building blocks of our myths, religions, and fairy tales. In the Jungian view, the characters of the fairy tale transcend their role as symbols of personal family dramas. They are external representations of the archetypal forces at play within every human soul. The wicked stepmother is the embodiment of the destructive mother archetype, a universal pattern of possessive, life-stifling power. The prince, in this reading, is the animus, a symbolic representation of the heroine's own inner potential for power and agency, which she must integrate to become whole. The journey of the fairy tale hero or heroine, therefore, is a map for what Jung called individuation. It is the process of confronting these different parts of the self, the shadow, the anima or animus, the wise elder, and integrating them into a whole and complete personality. The marriage at the end of the story becomes a symbol of this inner psychological union, the creation of a balanced and mature self. Psychoanalysis, in both its Freudian and Jungian forms, provided a transformative new language for understanding the haunting persistence of these tales. It argued that the castle of the fairy tale represented the very architecture of our own minds. The dark forest, the cruel stepmother, and the menacing wolf existed within us, a permanent part of the human condition, and the stories were a timeless guide to navigating our own inner wilderness. This idea of the fairy tale as a guide to our inner wilderness was taken up and popularized by one of the 20th century's most influential and controversial thinkers on child development. In 1976, the Austrian-born psychologist Bruno Bettelheim published The Uses of Enchantment, a book that would fundamentally change how a generation of parents and educators viewed these ancient stories. His core argument was both simple and revolutionary. The darkness in fairy tales is essential. Bettelheim, drawing heavily on Freudian psychoanalysis, argued that a child's inner life is a chaotic and terrifying place, filled with feelings of rage, jealousy, and a deep-seated fear of abandonment. He believed that the sanitized, cheerful stories popular in the modern era did a grave disservice to children. These stories, he claimed, presented a false picture of the world, leaving children alone with their big, bad feelings and no tools to understand or process them. The classic untamed fairy tales, Bettelheim argued, offer the child a language for this inner chaos. They acknowledge the reality of evil, the existence of death, and the truth of injustice. The wicked stepmother is a safe, external figure onto whom a child can project their own complicated and often angry feelings toward their real mother. The ravenous wolf gives form to the child's own greedy oral impulses. By giving these dark feelings a concrete, symbolic form, the fairy tale allows the child to confront them at a safe distance. The child can grapple with the idea of sibling rivalry by cheering for Aschenputtel against her stepsisters. They can process their fear of abandonment through the trials of Hansel and Gretel. Bettelheim insisted that the stories achieve their effect by simply presenting the struggle, without direct preaching or moralizing. Crucially, the fairy tale always shows a way through the struggle. The hero or heroine, despite being small and seemingly helpless, is always able to overcome the giant, the witch, or the wolf. This victory, Bettelheim argued, provides the child with a vital and deeply necessary sense of hope. It teaches them that while monsters are real, they can be overcome, and that the struggles of growing up are not insurmountable. The happy ending of the fairy tale, in this reading, becomes an essential psychological promise. It is the assurance that grappling with the darkness within oneself will lead not to destruction, but to a higher state of maturity and integration. The marriage to the prince is the symbolic reward for having successfully navigated the treacherous inner wilderness. The uses of enchantment became a cultural phenomenon. It gave generations of parents permission to return to the darker, more complex versions of the tales collected by the Grimms. Bettelheim's work was a potent counter-argument to the centuries of sanitization, a resonant declaration that the haunting truth of the fairy tale was not something to be feared or erased, but a vital and nourishing tool for the building of the human soul. When seen as a tool for building the soul, our two case files are transformed. The story of Cinderella is no longer a socio-economic drama about the marriage bargain. It becomes an internal, psychological journey about the nature of the self. The hearth, the place of ashes, is a symbol for a state of depression and despair, a period of psychic hibernation where one's own worth is forgotten. From this perspective, the cruel stepmother and stepsisters transcend their role as external abusers to become the personification of the heroine's own shadow self, the internal voices of self-doubt, despair, and crippling envy that keep her trapped in the cinders. The impossible tasks, like sorting lentils from the ash, represent the seemingly hopeless struggle of sorting out one's own tangled and chaotic feelings. The magical helper, the bird in the tree, is the arrival of hope, a connection to the healthy, benevolent part of the psyche, the good mother archetype that has been repressed. The prince is the idealized animus, the symbol of the heroine's own potential, her own agency and power in the world. The royal wedding, therefore, is the story's final, triumphant symbol of individuation, the union of the wounded self with its own power, a celebration of psychological wholeness. Likewise, the story of Little Red Riding Hood is reframed. It becomes a complex allegory for a young girl's transition from the world of childhood into the trials of young adulthood. The path is the straight and narrow way of innocence, and the girl's decision to stray from it to pick flowers is a symbol of her first, tentative steps into a more complex and alluring world of experience. The wolf, in this reading, is the embodiment of a dangerous, untamed, and seductive masculine force. He is also a symbol for the girl's own primal, instinctual nature, the id in Freudian terms. The famous dialogue in the grandmother's bed becomes a curious exploration of the raw, untamed nature of the physical self. The act of being swallowed by the wolf is a symbolic death, the end of childhood innocence. The rescue by the huntsman, in this light, is the intervention of the superego, the force of social order and morality, who rescues the girl from her own dangerous instincts. He re-establishes control and brings her back to the safe, conscious world, reborn as a wiser, more socialized young woman who has learned to control her impulses. This psychoanalytic lens grants the tales a new and transformative relevance. It argues that their endurance is owed to their function as perfect, symbolic maps of our own inner lives. They shift from stories about what happened once, long ago, in a dark forest, to stories about what happens inside of us, every day. They are the ghosts of our own minds, given a face and a name. In the latter half of the 20th century, a new generation of thinkers, writers, and artists looked upon the ghosts of the fairy tale and decided it was time for an exorcism. Fueled by the intellectual energy of the second wave feminist movement, they turned a critical eye on the beloved stories of their childhoods. They argued that these tales, far from being timeless and innocent, were potent tools of social conditioning that actively taught young girls to be passive, helpless, and to wait for a man to give their lives meaning. The primary target of this critique was the very model of femininity that the Brothers Grimm had perfected. The archetype of the helpless heroine, the beautiful, inert princess in a glass coffin or an enchanted sleep, was identified as a deeply damaging cultural ideal. Critics like Andrea Dworkin and Marcia Lieberman argued that the sanitized fairy tale was a training manual for patriarchal society, a story that rewarded female passivity and punished female agency. The central argument was that the tales presented a constrictively narrow set of roles for women. A woman could be the good, beautiful, and ultimately helpless heroine who is rewarded with marriage, or she could be the evil, ugly, and ambitious villain, the witch or the stepmother, who is ultimately punished and destroyed. The message was clear. For a woman, the exercise of agency and ambition is monstrous, while the performance of passive beauty is the path to salvation. This critique reframed the entire fairy tale landscape. The marriage bargain, once a utilitarian fantasy of survival, was now seen as the ultimate patriarchal trap, a story that taught girls that their only value was their beauty and their only successful outcome was to be acquired by a powerful man. This critique reframed the prince as the handsome face of a system that denied women their own autonomy. The goal of these critics and writers was the reclamation of the fairy tales. They argued that the passive princesses of the 19th century nursery were a perversion of a much older, tougher tradition. Their goal was to peel back the layers of Victorian and bourgeois morality, to shatter the glass coffin, and to rediscover the cunning, resilient, and often morally ambiguous heroines of the original oral tales, the girls who saved themselves. No author answered the call to rediscover the cunning heroine more powerfully or more shockingly than the English writer Angela Carter. Her 1979 collection of stories, The Bloody Chamber, was a poetic and explosive deconstruction of the classic tales, challenging the sanitized nursery versions. It is arguably the single most important work in the modern fairy tale tradition. Carter's method was to take the familiar structures of the tales, particularly those of Charles Perrault, and to inhabit them with a modern, female consciousness. She cracked open the sanitized surface of the stories to explore what she called their latent content, the unspoken undercurrents of desire, power, and violence that the originals hinted at but never dared to confront. In her most famous retelling, The Company of Wolves, she resurrects the cunning girl from the oral tradition. Her heroine is a fearless, self-aware young woman who, upon meeting the wolf in the woods, is not frightened, but intrigued by the encounter. The story ends not with her being eaten, but with her deliberately seducing the werewolf, laughing at him, and climbing into bed with him on her own terms, a willing partner rather than a helpless victim. In the title story, a retelling of Bluebeard, she transforms the tale from a warning about female curiosity into a celebration of it. The young heroine's decision to unlock the forbidden chamber is portrayed as a courageous act of self-discovery, a desire to know the full, monstrous truth about the man she has married. And her salvation comes not from God or a king, but from her own mother, who rides to the rescue on a stallion, shotgun in hand, a fierce, matriarchal agent of justice. Carter's heroines are complex, self-aware, and often complicit in their own fates. They are explorers of a world where desire and danger are inextricably linked. They understand, as their oral tradition ancestors did, that the wolf is a predator, but they also recognize their own wolfish appetites. Their stories dispense with the notion of being saved, focusing instead on the difficult, often dangerous, business of self-preservation. Her project was to reveal the fairy tale as a story about the stark economics of the flesh. She exposes the marriage bargain as a dangerous transaction that can literally be a matter of life and death. She argues that for centuries, the tales have been used to create a system of terror designed to keep women in their place. Her retellings are an act of rebellion against that system. With The Bloody Chamber, Angela Carter reopened the door to the dark forest for a new generation of writers and readers. She gave them permission to be fearless, to be critical, and to find the monstrous, the sensual, and the powerful within the familiar bones of the old stories. She is the godmother of the modern dark fairy tale, the one who proved that the most powerful ghost in the machine was the voice of the girl who was silenced. The silenced voice of the cunning girl is the one that modern audiences are clamoring to hear. The contemporary explosion of dark fantasy, of gritty reboots, and of morally complex fairy tale retellings reflects a deep cultural hunger for stories with genuine psychological and emotional weight. A hunger that the sanitized nursery tales can no longer satisfy. The work of critics and authors like Angela Carter cracked the door open, and the psychological insights of thinkers like Bettelheim explained why we needed that door to be opened. We now understand that the darkness is not an element to be erased. It is the source of the story's resonance. We need the famine wolf because we, too, experience ravenous desires. We need the hearth-stained outcast because we, too, have felt our worth go unrecognized. The sanitized versions, for all their commercial success, feel fundamentally dishonest to a modern audience. The promise of the huntsman, the guarantee that a benevolent authority will always arrive to rescue us from the consequences of our mistakes, rings hollow in a complex world. The perfectly passive, helpless heroine is an icon that no longer resonates. We have become reacquainted with the truth that her oral tradition ancestor always knew. The world is a dangerous place, and your own wits are your most valuable weapon. This return to the dark forest is a necessary act of cultural restoration. It is a collective effort to reclaim stories that challenge us, that acknowledge ambiguity, and that trust us to navigate a world that is not always black and white. The enduring power of the original tales lies in their unflinching honesty about the human condition. They are not comforting, but they are true. They are built from the bedrock of our oldest fears and our most profound desires. The fear of starvation, the hope of justice, the terror of the unknown, and the fierce, cunning instinct for survival. The haunting truth behind Europe's oldest fairy tales is, in the end, a truth about ourselves. The The stories are a mirror, reflecting the ghosts of our collective past and the architecture of our own minds. And after centuries of looking at a polished, sanitized, and reassuring reflection, we are finally, once again, brave enough to see the magnificent, terrifying, and authentic face that has been waiting for us in the dark all along. The face in the dark has had many names and has worn many masks. The journey of the fairy tale is a history of transformation, a story about stories. The fairy tale has been a multitude of things across its long life. A pragmatic survival guide, a tool for instilling terror and obedience, a comforting promise of rescue, and a complex map of the human soul. It was born from the hard soil of a world defined by hunger and fear, a world that needed its heroines to be as cunning and as ruthless as the predators at their door. It was captured and polished in the glittering salons of an aristocracy that demanded lessons on etiquette, and then reforged in the studies of academics who required a moral blueprint for a new middle class. For centuries, its original, unsparing honesty was buried beneath layers of didacticism and sentimentality. Its voice was softened, its teeth were filed down, and its heroines were put in cages of helpless innocence. But the ghost in the machine could never be fully exorcised. The old truths, the ones rooted in the bedrock of our shared psychological and historical past, were always waiting to be rediscovered.